Alright, let's create our findmaya.cmake file. So here in Windows, I'm just going to create a new file called findmaya.cmake and open up my text editor. Alright, good to go. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do is create a variable in CMake with the set function. That's how you create variables, and we'll call it Maya location. So on my computer, since I'm on Windows, my Maya is installed on C, Program Files, Autodesk. But this doesn't help all the people on Linux or Mac. This is only for Windows people. So in order to support all those other guys, we have to modify how we create this Maya location variable. So if we are on Windows, this is a way we can detect in CMake whether the running machine is Windows or if we're on Mac. Otherwise, we're on Linux. So if this is Linux, this is Mac, and this is Windows. So let's say instead of hard-coding the install prefix, the install path right here, we'll need to do a conditional for each platform. Let's call that Maya install base default, just because I feel like calling it that. So on Windows, we are at that path, and I can down here, I can then say use the variable my install base default instead of this guy, like so. So on Windows, we're at C, Program Files, Autodesk. On Mac, we are usually at something like Applications, Autodesk. And on Linux, we're usually around User, Autodesk. In addition to this path, Maya is usually installed into a subdirectory called Maya, and then whatever Maya version we have installed, whether it's Maya 2015, 14, 13, whatever you have. So we need a variable that can specify the Maya version for us. So let's do that at the top. We'll say set Maya version. Right now we'll just say 2015. Now if we just leave it like this, we're pretty much hard coding the Maya version, and if we wanted to compile for a different version, we would have to edit this file, which would be a big pain in the behind. So in order to be able to dynamically specify the Maya version, we'll add some arguments to this set function. We'll say cache string. This is the Maya version. And what this cache keyword does is it allows us to specify a value for this variable when we invoke CMake from the command line. That way we can support multiple versions of Maya without having to edit this file each time we want to change that version. And this string Maya version is just a comment where if you use a tool like the CMake GUI or you look in the generated cache files, you'll see an explanation of what this variable is used for. And just to be safe, we'll enclose this variable. We'll only do this if it hasn't been defined yet. Just like that. Alright, so now we have the Maya version taken care of. However, on Linux there is one additional step, because on Linux the install directory has a suffix called x64, like that, but that is only on Linux, that's not on Mac or Windows. So let's create another variable. We'll call it my install base suffix, and we'll call that x64. but on Windows and Mac, that is nothing. So now we can add that variable down here. Maya install base suffix. So now after we run through this code here, this Maya location variable will include the location where Maya is installed to, the Maya install base default for Windows, Mac, and Linux, the Maya version, and then any install base suffix. However, one thing we might want to do is allow the user to override where Maya is installed. Maybe they've installed it into a non-standard location. We want to be able to override that on the fly. So in order to support that, we'll do something similar to this cache string, which allows us to override a value. So let's create a variable. Let's just call it Maya install base path. And by default, we'll set it to our default value, Maya install base default. Then we'll allow the user to override it. And we'll call this the root Maya installation path. And then down here, we'll replace this with base path. So what we just did, by creating this variable here, this allows us to override these values up here. Maybe you, on Windows, maybe you installed Maya on a different drive, or on Mac, or Linux, maybe you're at a big studio where those are installed at a different location. You can override that value using this variable right here. And we'll learn how to do that when we run CMake. So now that we have the Maya location, we need to figure out where all the libraries and header files are for. And to help us with that, we're going to use a function called findPath, and we're going to store the result of that function in a variable called MyLibraryDir. And how this works is you specify a file that you're searching for in a subdirectory tree of a certain root directory. So, for example, on Windows, we're going to look for a library called openmaya.lib. We're going to search in the Maya location variable that we just created up here. And we want to search in the subdirectories called lib, because we know that the Maya libraries are installed in the lib folder. And you can double check that by just browsing. Here's my Maya install directory, and here's the lib folder, and there's all the folders. Here's openmaya.lib, and we could create some little documentation to help. CMake like that. So when this runs, we'll have a variable called Maya library directory where it searches for this library in this location in these subdirectories. However, .lib is Windows only, and Linux or Mac might not have their libraries in this subdirectory. So we have to create some variables up here to support all the different packages. So on Windows, let's set the OpenMaya library is going to be called openmaya.lib. On Mac, let's see, the OpenMaya library isn't called .lib, but it's called lib openmaya.dilib. And on Linux, it's called lib openmaya.sl. So now that we have that value for each platform, we can replace this with the variable openmaya. But we also have to support the library subdirectory for each package. So by default, let's call it mylib suffix. By default, that is just lib, like so. However, on Mac, it's not as easy. The libraries are actually in the Maya application, in the contents, Mac OS folder. So once we have that, that means we can replace the value down here with the mylib suffix variable. One additional thing we might want to do is maybe this, instead of having to specify the Maya location explicitly each time we run it, maybe we just want to allow an environment variable to be set of where Maya is installed. So we can do that by supporting, just by adding the environment variable like so. So env will access the environment variables. So all the paths listed here, CMake will just go through and try to find this library in each of these paths using this path suffix. So after this runs, Maya library directory will most likely be set to where your libraries are. On Windows, that would be C program files, Autodesk, Maya, whatever Maya version you are, and then lib. On Mac, that would be Maya.app contents, Mac OS, and Linux, you'd have user Autodesk, Maya 2015 lib, or Maya 2015-x64 lib. So once we have that, we can move on to finding our header files. And finding the header files is pretty much the same as finding the libraries. We can use find path. We're going to create a variable called Maya include directory. We're going to search for one of the standard Maya headers. Let's do mfn.h. And we'll do the same thing we did up here. We'll just copy and paste it down there. Search in the Maya location, accept the path suffix. Let's call it include suffix. This is the include path. So the include suffix, we have to do the same thing since it's stored in different locations depending on if you're on Windows, Mac, or Linux. So by default, the include suffix, we'll call it include. Because if you look at where that's installed, Maya 2015, here's include, and there's all the headers in here. However, on Mac, it's a bit different. So on Mac, it's stored in the dev kit include folder. Linux, it's stored also in the include folder, so we don't need to do anything special for Linux there. Now that we've located both the library directory and the include directory, let's access the individual Maya libraries themselves. So in order to do that, I'm just going to list all the libraries that we need with Maya like this. We'll make a variable called Maya libraries, and we want to find OpenMaya, OpenMaya anim, effects, render, UI, and foundation. So if I just specify a bunch of values like this, it's sort of making an array attribute. And when I do that, I can iterate through each one using for each, something like this. So for each of these libraries, what I'm going to do, let me just close this loop here. I'm going to call a function called find library. And I'm going to store the results in a variable called mylib library. So what I did here is I basically created a variable name based off of another variable name. So when I iterate through this, this will be Maya OpenMaya library, Maya OpenMaya anim library, and so on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to find that library in the library directory, which I already found up there. So if I paste that down here, like that, that means this will try to find each corresponding library in the library directory and save it in that variable. One additional argument that we'll add to this find library is a CMake keyword called no default path, and that basically will ignore some of the default system libraries, and mostly that helps resolve conflicts where I've encountered some things on Mac where maybe a class name or something like that conflicts with some Maya classes. So specifying this will fix that. So once I've found that library, what I'm going to do is store the result into a new array attribute, like this. It's kind of tricky syntax, but what I'm doing is I am adding the value that I just found right here and appending it to this attribute. This is weird syntax. It's basically just you can use this to append values to a list attribute. So after this loop runs, what we'll have is this myLibraries variable that contains the absolute path of each individual library. So far we have the library directory, the include directory, and the absolute path of each individual Maya library. And that's basically it for the most part. One thing we need to wrap up our CMake package, our CMake module, is to call this include find package handle standard args. And then call this function standard args Maya default message Maya include directory and Maya libraries. What this does is the values we specify here will tell CMake if these aren't found, then throw an error. So if CMake can't find any of this stuff, this will cause CMake to throw an error and not let you generate your project, which is what we want, because if you can't find them, then we can't compile it. So to summarize what we've done so far, first we've specified our Maya version, if we haven't already specified it. Here we're specifying the location of where Maya is installed for each platform, Windows, Mac, and Linux, and we use that to generate this variable where Maya is installed. Once we know where Maya is installed, then we can find the library directory and the header directory or the include directory and search for each individual Maya library using find library. Once we have that, then we can wrap up the module by calling this CMake function find package handle standard args and pass in the variables that we just generated.